Welcome, welcome, everybody. All right. Well, my name is Gianna. I'm one of the reference librarians here at the Chelmsford Public Library. Thank you to everyone for joining us for tonight's program, Murder, Mayhem, and Scandals in New York. Are you interested in finding out about being tarred and feathered, shot by the Black Hand in Little Italy, being caught in a great fire or ravishing flood? Participating in a riot, perhaps, attending some fascinating trials, or encountering some of the most unsavory characters who ever lived in New York City? Of course, this doesn't count meeting all the ghosts that haunt the city either. Then this is the presentation for you. And don't worry, it isn't as gory as it sounds. So tonight's presenters are Susan and Art Zuckerman. They are licensed tour guides, radio talk show hosts, authors, college professors, historians, lecturers, and world travelers. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it back over to Susan and Art.
Okay, thank you very much. By the way, just to introduce ourselves, I'm Art and this is Susan. We've been married for a few years, 48 years, and we do many different presentations, buses and vans and walking tours of New York City and the metropolitan area, and also in Massachusetts as well. So we have spent a lot of time in New England, and we do this. We run the History Channel, we're in the Travel Channel, London Television, and a lot. So we do about 85 different presentations. This evolved, by the way, because we are approved by New York State to teach teachers. So this is this is a modification of a teacher class that's 15 hours long. So we'll keep you to midnight tonight. Hope you guys bring your pillows with you and do that. Susan teaches New York City history at a college and also, of course, world history and American history as well. So we're going to be going through a lot. Today, you're going to cover not just in the New York area, you're going to cover a lot of New England. We'll talk about this young lady from New Bedford, Massachusetts, named Hetty Green. We'll be talking about her because she was really a lot of mayhem. Okay, but let's get started. Susan, you want to tell them about?
Okay, and what everybody's going to be muted and your videos will be off during the presentation. However, at the end, you will have the opportunity to open up if you have questions to ask or you have any comments. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, so let's get started. Okay. Okay, let's turn back to New Amsterdam and colonial New England. Okay, I'm sure most of you know that we were in New York anyway. We were Dutch before we were English. That was in 1624. The last Dutch governor was a gentleman named Peter Stuyvesant. He was kind of a tyrant, to say the least. If you look at some of the things he did not allow the citizens to do, he banned the sale of alcohol on Sundays. He had strict penalties for fighting with knives, initiated a curfew. He levied fines for not attending church, and you couldn't fornicate with the Indians at the time. He also was a major bigot. Okay, he was a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, and if you weren't, he didn't really want any part of you.
And you can see some of the people that he didn't care for. He didn't care for Lutherans, Jewish people, Roman Catholics, Quakerism, or anything. He was quite a bigot. Like that, but he kept New York under control. This is about 1624. New York gets settled. By the way, in the 1650s, they created a wall across the city to keep out the English, to keep out the Native Americans. Remember, these are not Indians. Indians are from India. These are indigenous people and Native Americans, and they wanted to keep them out. So they built this wall across the city. You'll never guess when they ripped down this wall, what they called that street. Of course, Wall Street. Here's an example of some of the punishments that he made for not paying attention to him. He was pretty tyrannical guy.
Which again wasn't just unique to New York. I'm sure some of you living in Massachusetts recognize, the stocks and dunking stools and everything, but they were the common punishments of the day. But he did get the city under control, and in 1664, the British decided they wanted this little colony, so they sailed into New York Harbor with ships with huge guns pointed to this little wooden city, and they said, give up your colony or we will blow you up. Guess what? The people said, we give up. They didn't care who governed them. Okay, we give up. And so one day they were Dutch, the next day they were English.
The biggest criteria they had was they wanted to make money, and as long as they can make money.
They
But
didn't
let's
care.
move on to someone who became very prominent in New York at the time and New England. This is Captain Kidd. And here is, if you look over here, here's the wall. You can see it's being built. And look over in the right-hand side, you see the water? By the way, that the women would come up to the water's edge and look for pearls. And they were, the pearls were, you know, they would open up the oyster shells and look for pearl. That became in New York City, Pearl Street. And by the way, the area to the right-hand side became Maiden Lane, because that's where the maidens would wash their laundry at the water's edge. And that's why those names stuck there. But Captain Kidd had some
Now,
interesting
I don't know if you think of New York City and pirates, but some of the most notorious pirates hung out in New York City, one of being Captain Kidd. Now, he was a charming gentleman, and there's all kinds of rumors that there was buried treasure on some of the islands off the coast of Manhattan, where he buried his treasure.
Liberty Island and Ellis Island.
Right, but nobody knows, because what Kidd supposedly did is after he had his crew buried the treasure, he would kill the crewmen who buried it, so nobody but him knew where it was. Well, eventually he got his comeuppance. He was hanged. Now, this is not Kidd. Kidd was actually hanged in England, but this was a common thing that they used to do when they caught pirates or other people condemned to death. They would hang them on something called a gibbet. It would be on one of the islands. The most notorious was actually what's now Ellis Island. And they would hang them there, and it would be weekend entertainment. They would have a public hanging, and people would actually take boats out and have picnics around Ellis Island to see the people.
It was quite an attraction. Well, in 1701, remember in 1664, we're no longer in New Amsterdam, we are now New York. And in 1701, the English in 1664 actually appointed certain people to be governors of this. And here is a governor of New York. Look at this person over here to your left-hand side. I always ask men when they see this, would you date that person? And most of the responses come back and say, no, absolutely not. They wouldn't date that person. Number one, because it's a male. This was it, and this is true now. We're not making this up. This is the Lord Governor of New York. His name is Edward Hyde. Some of you may remember that there was a place called Hyde Park where Franklin Roosevelt had his home. And this is named after Edward Hyde. Remember, he was given real estate. So all the way up New England, he had real estate. And Hyde Park was one of his places, named after this particular gentleman. And by the way, the reason he dressed like a woman is because he was very proud that he looked like his cousin who had appointed him a position. And this was the Queen of England.
She was on the
So
right.
she appointed him, and he wanted to thank her, so he dressed up like a woman. He,
Right.
by the way, had 7 children. And if you're a male today and you're interested, there is something called the Cornbury Society for men who are cross-dressers. And this is in British Columbia in Canada. So if you are interested in becoming a cross-dresser, you can send us an email. We'll be happy to send you an application.
Yeah, and he had other terrible traits. He got so bad, in fact, that the populace had him kicked out for running the thing. Now, here's something I think as New Englanders you can relate to. During the time right before the American Revolution, they had things called tarring and feathering. Well, New York was no exception. Very often they would take some of the British officers and tar them and feather them, or anybody who published any materials that the Patriots were not thrilled with did the same thing. They did it a lot to tax collectors. So very common thing all the way through New York and New England at the time.
Now, one of the interesting characters that you'd find in American history is King George III. Now, if you saw the movie or the Broadway show, Hamilton, he was one of the humorous characters in there. King George III was the He stayed in office. This is going back to about the 1760s during the Revolutionary War. He had a very interesting characteristic. He was crazy. And even though the monarch, he stayed in the office, or I guess as monarch for over 60 years. And by the way, show him the next picture. This is the picture from the show Hamilton. He had a condition called rosacea, right? Prophoria, which was a condition where he had convulsions and different things. He was really, remember, he stayed in office for 60, office. He stayed as a monarch for 60 years.
It was truly
and he had a very interesting comment, personality about his thing. Now, if you go to it, there was a statue in New York City during the Revolution, 1776. What did New Yorkers do? They ripped down the statue of King George III in Bowling Green, which is the southern tip of Manhattan Island. And you know what they did with it? They melted it down. They made bullets and shot the British with it. So this is one of the things King George III, he had this condition called prophoria. And when you, by the way, if you speak to people from England who know about him, their eyes will go up in their heads and they'll say, wow, what a nut this guy was. He was really crazy. Right. But he was the monarch and he could get away with anything.
Right. Now, as tour guides, people always ask us why New York doesn't have a lot of historical buildings. Remember, the city started in 1624. For example, Boston has many older buildings than New York City. Well, two reasons. One is there was the Great Fire of 1776. This is when the British actually set fire to New York City at the beginning of the Revolution. So they destroyed many of the older buildings that were in the city. And then we'll find out a second reason later on that you also lost a lot of older buildings. That was one.
Now remember, the Revolutionary War started 1776 and then 1783. In 1783, the British, after years of occupying the city, actually evacuated the city and gave up. They actually gave up after 7 years. One of the things they did is when they're leaving the city now, and all the Americans are making faces at them and saying, don't ever come back again, they had put the flag up right in the southern tip of New York City at that time. They put the flag, it was a British flag, and you see it's flying down here now. And they had greased the poles. They greased the poles to make sure no one could get up there. Well, a man was very inventive. His name was John Van Arsdale. And there is a plaque right by the Bull, if you know a little bit about Manhattan Island.
Manhattan, the Bull of Wall Street.
The Bull of Wall Street. There is a pole there that has a little plaque on it and it says, honoring John Van Arsdale for ripping down the British flag and putting up the American flag. And that was an evacuation day that became quite famous.
Now, about that same time in New York City, you had a lot of medical students who were having a very hard time getting cadavers to practice on. So what they would do is they would go to the local graveyard and they would steal them. Well, one time there was a situation where these young medical students are robbing a grave and this little boy is watching, and to chase him away, they hold up this arm of this person and say, oh, this is your mother's arm and whatever, not knowing that really his mother had just died. And he went home and got really upset. And the New York City residents were not too happy. They ascended on the students and really tried to, get them to stop doing this. They finally came to an agreement where if a family's loved one died, they could donate the body to the medical school. In exchange, the students agreed never to rob a grave again. But it was one of the first big riots we had in New York City called the Doctors' Riot. Okay, and where it took place is where what's now City Hall Park in New York City. We're trying to give you a little geographic perspective if you've ever been to New York or if you ever come to New York, so you'll know where these things happened.
Well, one of the remnants that has remained, by the way, is in an area called Washington Square Park. This is the home of NYU, New York University. And here's the campus, and you can see in the background, you see the Arc de Triomphe, modeled after it, designed by an architect named Stanford White, who did some work in Boston as well. And what they were doing is they were digging up, I guess, at some point because some of the piping system had broke, and they opened it up and they found out that people have been buried there. The park, without going into a lot of detail, is estimated over 1,000 people have been buried in the park. Now, speaking of the park, there's something else there that's there. This is the hanging elm tree. This is a tree, by the way. There's a little plaque there, hard to see, and this is a track in there. And this particular tree, by the way, goes back to the 1776 area. And in about early 1800s, a man comes back, and here's the statue of the man. His name is Marquis de Lafayette. Comes back to America, and they want to show, this is the years after the war, even after the War of 1812, and they want to show Lafayette that they had America under control, and they had 11 people being hung from this particular tree. It's called a hanging elm tree, and it's in the middle of Greenwich Village near Washington Square Park.
Right. Now, another interesting place is, if you look at the middle picture, in one of the buildings in Soho, there is actually a well underneath the building. For a long time, the building was called the Manhattan Bistro, and now it's really a clothing store, but the well still exists. Now, what's the story with the well? Well, there was a young man named Levi Weeks who supposedly murdered his fiancée and threw her body into this well. Well, this brought up one of the most controversial trials ever in New York City. Levi Weeks had a brother named Ezra Weeks. Ezra Weeks was a man who decided, he was an architect, and he was hired by a man named Alexander Hamilton to build his home called the Grange. And he asked if Alexander Hamilton could please represent his brother in this murder trial. And Hamilton said, yes, I could, but I'm not really a criminal lawyer. Let me get a friend of mine who is also a criminal attorney to help. Who did he get? Aaron Burr. They were the dream team. They just, of course, the O.J. Simpson trial has just come to light again with everything with his death. Well, this was the dream team of 1800 when you had Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr on the same side defending Levi Weeks. Make a long story short, they got him off. He was probably guilty as sin, but there were curses attached to everything with the trial, and most of them came true. So
now here are two men, by the way. Later on, here is the dueling flash of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton supposedly shot up in the air, and Burr didn't. Now, one of the things that people don't know, if you saw the show Hamilton, is that Hamilton, when the duel occurred, after this was insults and arguments going on over the years, there were many, many reasons that Hamilton and Burr didn't get along. And we won't go into all of those. We do a Hamilton tour of New York City. It's a full day, 8-hour tour, visiting all these places in Hamilton. Hamilton, when the duel happened, this is in a place called Weehawken, New Jersey, across the way from Manhattan. And Hamilton wound up putting on his glasses. When Burr saw that, he said, man, this guy must be serious about this thing. Most of these duels, they shot up in the air. This one didn't happen. And the rest is history, where Alexander Hamilton is killed by Aaron Burr. By the way, Aaron Burr, here he is over here. Now he's older. He became an albatross of American history. And here is Aaron Burr. And he wound up, when he was in his 70s, he wound up marrying the richest woman in New York City, this woman over here on your left-hand side, named Eliza Jumel. There was a Morris Jumel mansion in Manhattan, one of the oldest buildings in New York City. And when Aaron Burr married her, after a month, she realized that he had married her for her money. He was quite a cad, Burr. Wound up marrying her, and she decides after a month of being married to this guy, knowing that he was just taking advantage of her, that she was going to divorce him. Here's a twist in American history most people don't realize. She decides to hire a lawyer to represent her in the divorce proceedings. Who did she hire as a lawyer? Again, this is 30 years after Alexander Hamilton was shot and killed. She hired Alexander Hamilton's son. There's a twist in American history.
Right. Now, we said before part of New York City was destroyed by the British in 1776. Well, another good chunk of the city was destroyed by the Great Fire of 1835. This one was accidental, but it did destroy a lot of the older buildings that had remained and survived the first fire. And that's basically why New York doesn't have a lot of very old buildings, at least not on Manhattan Island anymore. Now, let's turn to another story. We talked about this is murder, mayhem, and scandals. Well, 1800s recreation, ladies of negotiable virtue. Okay. There was a man named Patsy Conroy. He was the leader of one of the most ruthless, ambitious gangs that terrorized New York City. And he controlled an area between the Manhattan Bridge and the Williamsburg Bridge along the East River in the very early 20th century and even dating back before that. And one of the things he was invested in was the sex business. Sex has always been big business in New York City. I'm sure we're not alone. There were brothels almost everywhere in the city. There were concentrations of neighborhoods where they had 100 brothels in a square block. Can you imagine? And these brothels used to have all kinds of ads selling sex.
This was big business. This wasn't small time. Here's some advertisements, by the way, giving you an idea. Look at the one on the right-hand side. This is Madam Molly's House of Sin. Will make you forget the rest. Visit Molly's and her golden-haired sirens. Okay.
And they would talk about the best liquor and the best. Well, and these were actually published
very elegant, very elegant.
newspapers and pamphlets.
If you go to an area in New York City called Soho, which is south of Houston Street, it's now pronounced Houston, and here is one of the existing buildings that still remains today, but this was once a brothel. Now, speaking about brothels, and here's a dispute that we have with people from New England. There was a park in New York City on the east side, and this was called Corlear's Hook. Corlear's Hook. And women of the evening would come down here during this park to patronize and sell their wares.
The gentlemen there.
Okay. And they would come down here and they would come to the Hook, and they became known as hookers. I know, having worked in New England for a while, there is a dispute whether General Hooker, who brought his women of the evening with him, was there. So we can debate that, but that's something we'll leave open to another time. Here is what Corlear's Hook looks like
today. Now, it's interesting. If you look at the amphitheater that was there, this was in terrible disrepair. And New York City was not in any financial shape to get this amphitheater redone as a recreation area. They had too much other things, but the people in the neighborhood wanted it done. So they decided to hire somebody to use her influence to get this park finished. And what was taking the citizens years to get done, she got done in 6 months. Who was it? Her name was Erin Brockovich.
This is the real Erin Brockovich.
Right.
She used her feminine ways to get this thing done quickly.
In 6 months, right.
But talking about brothels and talking about, this was a very controversial woman.
Yeah, her name was Madame Restell. Now, Madame Restell had an interesting occupation. She was a female abortionist. And she was very skilled at what she did. And she was hired by some of the wealthiest people, men, especially during the Gilded Age, who many had mistresses and they got pregnant. And they would keep her on a retainer to make sure that the pregnancies were terminated. She was so successful at her job that she winds up building a mansion. This was her mansion on Fifth Avenue. And where was it? It was next to St. Patrick's Cathedral. Okay. Well, eventually, there was so much public pressure put on Madame Restell that she actually wound up committing suicide over all the controversy.
Now, learning a lot about New York City, you'll probably appreciate the movie that was done a couple of years ago by Martin Scorsese, and this was The Gangs of New York. This was one of the worst neighborhoods in the history of the United States. Actually, in the building that you're looking at right now in the middle, which is called the Old Brewery, that building actually averaged 1 murder per evening. And if you saw the movie with Daniel Day-Lewis and Leonardo DiCaprio, and here is Liam Neeson. Remember, there were 2 factions going on here now. But remember, when New York City at once was an Irish Catholic city. This is going back, if you go back to the famine years, and we teach Irish history, the famine years were 1845 to 1852. 1 million people died of starvation in Ireland, and 1 million people emigrated to America. And here is Liam Neeson is an Irish Catholic, and here is Daniel Day-Lewis, who is a native, actually American, and he didn't particularly like the Irish. He was Protestant versus Catholic, and this dispute and battle has been going on forever to do that. So in the movie, The Gangs of New York, you really get a perspective of what New York was like and how rough and tough it was at that time.
Especially this neighborhood.
Here is a short clip on what this neighborhood looked like at that time. The Gangs of New York.
On my challenge, we have met at this chosen ground to settle for good and all. Who holds sway over the 5 points? Us natives or the foreign hordes?
This knife that struck him down, let me put to rest my father's ghost.
Who are you?
You're the priest's son, aren't you? His name's Amsterdam.
Amsterdam. I'm New York.
Everything you see belongs to me. The newsboys and quick thieves and blind tigers here in paradise. Everybody owes, everybody pays.
What do you think you're doing?
I'm dancing.
So why aren't you dancing with him?
I'm not in love with him.
There's more of us coming off these ships every day. 15,000 Irish a week. Get all of us together and we ain't got a gang. We got an army.
Challenge.
Challenge accepted.
I took the father. Now I'll take the son. I give you my word. This'll all be finished tomorrow.
No, it won't.
If you see the movie, by the way, Martin Scorsese did a good job of capturing this period of time that most people have no idea exists. This is right in the middle of the Civil War, where Abraham Lincoln needed money and he needed men. And that was what happened. This is 1863 draft riot. We won't go into a lot of detail now. Let's talk about some of the people that were part of this thing.
Now, if you saw the movie, women were as bad as some of the men were. Now, they talk about bad men. Look at this. This was a woman named Hellcat Maggie. It was based on a real person. Look at her teeth. She had her teeth filed down. She wore hooks on her hands. And what she would do is, when she would get into a fight in the 5 points, she would bite off her victim's ear. She owned a bar, and she would keep the ears in a jar on her bar. So you can imagine, not a charming woman. Then there was another lady called Sadie the Goat, and she would basically butt you in the head. She'd have something in her hat, and she'd butt you in the head to knock you out, steal from you. And eventually she actually went on to become a pirate. So you had female pirates as well as male pirates in New York City. And this is some of the way they lived and some of the things that represented entertainment. They would have something called rat baiting and dog fighting and all kinds of, cockfighting and everything else that you can imagine down. It was not the nicest place to live. Okay. Now, as Art mentioned before, in the middle of this, you had the New York City draft riots. This was 1863. This was the middle of the Civil War. The North was losing. Lincoln needed 2 things. He needed men and he needed money. So what did he do? He decided that he would institute a draft. And here it is. But if you had $300, you could buy your way out of the draft.
Now, many of the immigrants coming here didn't have $3, let alone $300.
Right.
So people like the Astors and the Vanderbilts and people like that later on became very wealthy. But this is it. So this is a riot where during this riot, finally to put this riot down, because there was the two battles between what Leonardo DiCaprio's group looked like and Liam Neeson's group looked like. It became quite a battle. Here's a battle. To quell the battle, they couldn't stop these people from fighting. They actually called them up from a place called Gettysburg. And Gettysburg, they called the military up here to stop the fights, and eventually that did. But during this thing, over 1,100 people were killed. But this has been really passed over in American history.
Yeah. Somebody just asked where the 5 Points is today. Where the 5 Points is actually Chinatown in New York City. It's also where all of the courthouses are. If you went to see the Trump trial, you would be in the 5 Points. That's exactly where it was today. So has a very infamous history over the years.
Keep these questions. We'll be happy to give them to you later on.
And you can see what the riot did. It was really terrible. The wrath was taken out on innocent, free blacks. The blacks had already been freed in New York in 1827.
The resentment came up here because they thought the people coming up from the South, the former slaves, who are now looking for gainful employment, would be taking the jobs away from a lot of the Catholics who didn't have jobs at all. So they took their frustration out on a lot of the African Americans. And look at the picture over here on the right-hand side. Yeah. This is quite a bloody time. But there was a man who was very significant in the times in New York City. His name was Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed was 5'11", 300 pounds. He controlled something called Tammany Hall. And there is a building, by the way, in Manhattan called that's there today, called Tweed's Courthouse. This building was supposed to cost $250,000 in the 1860s and 1870s. It wound up costing $12 million. All that money was overcharged for all the people. And to give you an idea how Boss Tweed was, here's a picture of him. There's a characterization of him where he put his thumb on New York City, because he controlled New York City. He was more powerful than the mayors of New York City. And essentially he's putting his thumb on the city and it's saying, what are you going to do about it? And he wasn't. But he did have a nemesis, a guy who wanted to really show how bad he was as a person who controlled part of New York City's political situations. And that man's name was Thomas Nast.
Yeah, and Thomas Nast was a great cartoonist. Some of the good things he did was he gave us our version of what we think of today when we think of Santa Claus. It's this jolly, happy soul. He also was the one who started the Democratic and Republican symbols of the elephant and the donkey. So he did that. But he was also a major bigot. Okay, as much as he hated Tweed, he hated a lot of other people. And these were some of the characterizations he drew. Hated the Chinese, the characterization, hated the Irish, made them look ape-like. And so he did a lot of things to really rouse up the city at the time. Now, one of the biggest problems in New York City in the late 1800s,
and I'm sure New England
and I'm sure many cities across the country, was horse manure. A huge problem in New York City.
And urine.
Very, very bad problem. That's one of the reasons automobiles were invented, because of all the pollution by horses at the time. It was terrible. Can you imagine that? A horse produces 20 plus pounds of manure and 2 pints of urine per day, and they averaged about 150,000 horses.
Now, if you want a great book that you should have in your library, the next book is one of your classics. This is The Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894. And if you want to see how bad it was, they talked about horses that died in the streets. Look at these kids. They're playing in the streets. They couldn't care less that there's a dead horse right next to them. And now, not only that, but look at the streets. Can you imagine if you're wearing long Victorian dresses and you're walking across something like this, what you're going to drag along the lower portion of your horse? But New York had other problems. New York had wild pigs running around the streets. New York was known as Pig Town at one point. And there were over 20,000 hogs roaming the streets of New York City. Why did they allow that? Well, think about it. What do pigs eat? They eat garbage. And what happens when they eat a lot of garbage? They get fat. And what happens to a fat pig? You have food and a food substance. Well, enough of this manure talk. Let's move on now. Let's talk about another problem that New York had at
Another
this
thing
time.
of mayhem. Okay, this was the famous blizzard, New York of 1888, March 1888. And the biggest problem that New York City had, look at the picture on the right, okay? All of your power lines, your telegraph lines, your early telephone lines, everything was above ground. Well, when the blizzard came, it took most of the power lines down with it. Okay, you had elevated streetcars that couldn't operate above ground. It was really a terrible condition. Look at the streetcars, they're like frozen on the street. It was about 40 inches of snow in New York City. Now, when you guys get 40 inches of snow, it's a lot of snow, but there are modern methods to get rid of it. How did you get rid of it in those days? Look, horses and carriages, they try to get it into the river to throw it away. So it changed the whole complexion of New York City.
And the country.
Today, if you go to New York, into Manhattan, not the outer boroughs, but if you go into Manhattan today, all of your major lines are submerged underground. You do not see electrical lines, you don't see cable lines, you don't see anything. Everything is buried under the street, and it's all because of the blizzard of 1888. Okay. Now, this also brought up another controversy with electricity. You had two gentlemen who were at war with what kind of electricity or what kind of power was better. You have AC current, which was favored by George Westinghouse, and you had DC current, which was favored by Thomas Edison. And these guys were out to beat each other. And if you know anything about Edison, he said genius is 1%, inspiration 99% perspiration. Well, Edison decided to use an interesting ploy. He decided to prove not how good DC power was, but how dangerous AC current was. So, for example, they built the electric chair and they used AC current. And they said, oh, look what could happen to you, even accidentally, if you have AC current in your home. You might be electrocuted. And then to make matters worse, to really make a point, there was a poor elephant named Topsy. This is hard to see because this picture is from around 1903. Poor Topsy was a circus elephant who had been terribly abused by her trainer. And one day she killed him. She stomped him to death.
Well, he had given her a lit cigarette.
Yeah,
and
tried to do all kinds of things to her. Anyway, they tried all kinds of things. So they sentenced her to death. First thing they did was they were going to poison her with carrots. That didn't work. Then they thought of hanging her. That wasn't going to work. So the next thing is Edison said, oh, I have an idea. So what did they do? They brought her out to Coney Island and they electrocuted this poor elephant to show the public how dangerous AC current is. But to make a long story short, Edison didn't win the battle. AC current is still the current you use today in your home. DC current is used more for trains, subways, things of that nature.
Now, something very impactful happened on March 25th, 1911. There was this terrible tragedy in New York City where it was called a Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, where a fire broke out on the 7th floor of the buildings and 146 young people were killed in this fire. The people who owned the factory, and here's a sample of the factory. Once the fire broke out, they had locked the doors from the other side. And here is a picture of 146 young people died in this terrible tragedy. The building was fireproof, but the people inside. They found 11 engagement rings, by the way, during this particular thing. Here's the aftermath of the fire. Many of the people had jumped off the roof and out the windows. And here's an example of how they they jumped off. It was terrible tragic. This was the 9/11 of its day,
Right.
even though it wasn't an enemy fight. It was a terrible tragedy.
Now, if you want perspective, this is in Washington Square. The building is actually owned by NYU. Today, again, the building never burned, only the interior. Today, the building is NYU classrooms, and there are symbolic plaques on the building. And since 1911, every March 25th, they have a ceremony in front of the building. They put 146 white roses at the base of the building. And just about 4 or 5 months ago, they actually built a memorial going up the side of the building that lists the names of all of the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So if you ever go down there, you can actually look up the side of the building and see all the names.
Now, we've had some people who have been very controversial as well. Here is a man. Anyone know who this man is? Well, this is Enrico Caruso, the great opera singer. And he was beloved by New Yorkers until a couple of situations happened. He was in Central Park, and he was in the Monkey House, and he actually started groping women. And here is an article from the New York Times, and it says, another Monkey House episode, tenor and chum accused of corrupting boys. The opera singer, he was charged money for groping women in Central Park. He was brought into court and eventually was arrested, but he was allowed to go only for a $10 fine. That's because they loved him. But now there is a famous building in New York City. This was built about the 1870s, and this had famous trials in here. You know, we're talking about controversy in New York City. One of the trials that happened here was a trial of a man named Stephen Crane. And Stephen Crane, you might know, wrote a book called Red Badge of Courage. It became an American classic. But his first book was a book called Maggie, Girl of the Street. And here is written by Stephen Crane. It was a failure. The book was not great. It was about a young Irish girl who was destitute, who became a prostitute. And he decides, by the way, to investigate. The book wasn't a success. He decides to do some further investigation and improve the book. He goes out there. He's talking to young ladies on the street corners who are prostitutes. And by the way, they were picked up in a paddy wagon. Notice the name Paddy Wagon. This was Irish at the
A lot of
time.
anti-Irish sentiment.
Right. And this was it. And he was brought up on, he said to the people when they went to pick up these prostitutes that he had been talking to, he said, that's not a prostitute, it's my wife. And in court, under oath, he swore that this was his wife. And she wasn't. He was committing perjury. And he got in trouble for that. Okay. Here's another one, the murder of the century.
Now, this was the murder of the century before the O.J. Simpson was the murder of the century that you heard of. This was even a bigger trial. In fact, it was so big that they actually, this was in 1906. They actually made a movie in the late 1950s called The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing. And what was it about? It starred Ray Milland and Farley Granger and a young woman named Joan Collins. This was her first movie. Okay, and what was the movie about? Well, here's a little clip from the movie, and then we'll tell you the backstory. Come on. Not playing. Okay, never mind.
Well, the story behind this is we're having a little problem with the technical things. The woman in the middle is considered the most beautiful girl in America. And this is her, the famous architect, Stanford White, who has done things in Boston, many things in
He
Boston.
did the Boston Public Library.
And he did a lot of the Newport and Rhode Island mansions. He's having an affair with this young woman. He's 50 years old. She's 17 years old. And he would swing her in her birthday outfit in a red velvet swing in his bachelor pad. After a while, he decides that this is not the best thing for this young lady because he's a fairly decent guy, and men had women and mistresses at that time. And he decides that he stopped his relationship with this particular woman, and she gets coerced to be married to this man named Harry K. Thaw. Harry K. Thaw is a rich kid from Pittsburgh. His parents are millionaires, and he's a spoiled rich kid, and he's crazy. he hates the fact after he marries this young woman who he encourages her to marry him. After a while, he encourages that never to see this man Stanford White again. And he sees Stanford White. He hates the fact that White once had a relationship with his now wife. And he sees him at the original Madison Square Garden. This is Madison Square Garden in New York City. It's no longer there. And he sees him, he takes out a gun, and he kills him, and he becomes the murderer of the century. And here is the triangle between the murderer, the most prominent architect in America, and the most beautiful girl. And this becomes the murder of the century. To give you an idea, this is 1904 and 1906. This whole thing goes on for a couple of years, and this becomes the murder of the century. The History Channel still doing things about this, and books are still written about this episode.
Yeah, if you want to see the version that was done by the History Channel, and you can go online to get it, it's really terrific, and you'll see all the details. And it came out, and this was the courthouse that was done.
The murderer, by the way, is brought up eventually. The mother, this is wealthy, very wealthy family. The mother has bribed the jurors to get her son off, and they find out about this. They decide to bring a new jury trial case in there with new jurors, and she is now knows that he's going to be convicted. Here he is coming out of prison, and they try a new plea. The plea is temporary insanity, and that's one of the first times they try the corporate. Just to give you an idea how privileged this man was, here he is in prison, and the food was brought over from one of the most prominent restaurants in New York City called Delmonico's, and he is given in a multi-room jail cell. He's eventually, by the way, rather than being executed because he clearly has killed this man in plain sight, they plead insanity, and they put him in a mental institution. He escapes the mental institution, by the way. They try him again, but what kicks in? Double jeopardy. And he's released, and because they can't try him for that second crime twice. And he's walking down the street. There's a story about him. Here he is, now released. Evelyn Nesbit, the beautiful girl, is out of the picture completely. The mother told her she divorced her son. She'll give her $1 million. She divorces him and gives her nothing. And here he is walking down the street, and his friend over here to the right-hand side, or to his left, looks up at a building and says to the murderer, he says, "That's an ugly building." And you know what the murderer said to him? "I think I killed the wrong architect." That's to give you an idea. So, but there's been a lot of controversy and different things.
Third trial.
Here's one of my favorite one.
This is the third trial.
This is the third trial. This is Mae West. Remember Mae West, who said she used to be like Snow White, then she drifted. And here she is. She was doing a show in New York City in 1926. And the show was called Sex. The New York Times wouldn't even print a title because it was so controversial. The show had been running 11 months. And the mayor of New York City was a man named Gentleman Jimmy Walker, who couldn't care less about any of this stuff. He was busy writing music and fooling around with his mistress. He goes on vacation to Europe with his mistress, and the assistant mayor comes up and decides to talk to Mae West. And he realized that she made a pass in Mae West, and Mae West rejected him. He decides, the assistant mayor, to bring up on trial for lewd behavior.
Yeah. So the trial was held in the Jefferson Market Courthouse. Okay. She was found guilty and sentenced to 10 days in jail. But she had it real rough in the jail. She had actually a 3-room jail cell. People from Delmonico's restaurant would bring her food every day. The warden used to take her out for carriage rides and to meet his mother. The women of NYU named her Woman of the Year. So she didn't exactly do badly with this publicity. And if you don't remember Mae West, here's a little clip showing some of her greatest lines.
Okay, we're having a little problems with the technical thing. Here is Mae West with one of her buddies. This is Cary Grant,
Right.
who she worked with. And we're not sure why it was working a few minutes ago. It doesn't seem to be working now. Here is where the courthouse was, over here on the right-hand side. This is the courthouse. And next to it, by the way, to the right-hand side, the building's no longer there. That's the Women's House of Detention over here. And here are 2 women who were put in incarcerated in that particular prison. And
Right.
one is Angela Davis in the lower right-hand corner.
And Ethel Rosenberg, who was accused of spying for the Russians at the time. But speaking of not so nice women, okay, here we come to a New Bedford native. Her name was Hetty Green. She was called the Witch of Wall Street and the Miser of Wall Street. When Forbes did a discussion about 10 years ago of the 40 richest people who ever lived in America, she was the only woman on the list. She was worth, in today's money, about $17 billion, but she was very, very stingy, to put it bluntly. Like, you could see the way she dressed like a witch. She would only have the bottom of her dress clean to save money. She lived in a poor rooming house, and she cooked her meager food
In New
on a
York.
radiator
New York.
instead of in a stove. She never had business meetings in an office. She didn't want to pay the rent, so she would use the bank vault to have her meetings. She once spent 3 hours looking for a 2-cent stamp.
Now she had two children.
She did. She did. And one of the charming things she did as a mother was when they had a birthday, she put candles in the cake, but she wouldn't light them so she could use them again the next year. But the worst thing she ever did was when her son was about 10 years old, he broke his leg. So she decided to take him to a free clinic to be treated. Well, they recognized who she was and they said, no, you're Hetty Green, you can afford it. She wouldn't pay. So she goes to another one, same story, third one. By the time she finally got medical treatment for her son, gangrene had set in and they had to amputate his leg.
Now, we used to write for a local newspaper, and we wrote something about Mother's Day, and we said, if you don't like your mother, read about this one. And this was Hetty Green, known as the Witch of Wall Street and the Miser of Wall Street.
Okay, now here's an interesting woman. Her name was Emma Goldman. She was nicknamed Red Emma. She came from Russia. This was in the days when socialism was starting in the United States around the turn of the century. She was arrested several times. Here's one of her charming mugshots. And one of her biggest adversaries was a man named Henry Clay Frick. Henry Clay Frick was Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man down in the steel mills in Pennsylvania. And he was the henchman. He was, the enforcer. Carnegie was known as this benevolent, wonderful person. And in many ways he was. But when something bad happened, he kind of took a hike and usually went back to Scotland, and he let Frick control the thing. Well, Emma and her boyfriend were not too happy with his behavior, especially when a strike broke out in Homestead, Pennsylvania at one of Carnegie's steel mills. And it turned out that 9 workers were killed by Pinkerton detectives that had been hired to put down any kind of rioting that was there. So Emma Goldman and her boyfriend, Sasha Berkman, decide to kill Frick, but they need a way to get to Frick. And Berkman was poor, kind of disheveled. So they said that, well, the first thing they have to do is get him a suit so he looks presentable and can go into the office and represent himself and get close to Frick. So what does Emma do? Now, you saw what she looked like. She decided to prostitute herself. Well, she met the first John. John took one look at her, guess felt sorry for her, gave her $10. She goes out, she buys a suit for Berkman. Berkman makes an appointment with Frick, goes into his office, tries to shoot him and stab him with a poison tip knife. Unfortunately, neither one worked. However, he and Emma were promptly deported back to Russia, where they came from.
By the way, some perspective, Andrew Carnegie at that time would have been, well, even today, rich, he would have been worth $100 billion. John D. Rockefeller would have been the richest man in America at that time at $183 billion. Cornelius Vanderbilt $90 billion, and John Jacob Astor, $80 billion. Obviously, Bezos and Elon Musk have exceeded that, but at that time, Rockefeller and Carnegie would have been the richest men in America.
Okay, now New York has been the site of several examples of unrest in the United States. One of the most famous things that was not known for many years happened in 1916. A place called Black Tom Island. Now, where is Black Tom Island? Black Tom Island was a little island between Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. Today, it's part of Liberty State Park. It's actually been, land has been filled in, but at one time it was an island with a lot of industry on the island. In 1916, Europe was involved in World War I. We were not. We were supposed to be neutral. However, we were storing ammunition for the British and the French during World War I. The Germans found out what we were doing, and what they did was they promptly sabotaged Black Tom Island, blowing it up like this. There was so much damage done that it actually damaged the Statue of Liberty, poked holes in it with shrapnel. You can see that they think 50 people died during the time. Now, this was a big cover-up because Wilson denied any kind of knowledge of this. He said, no, it was a terrible industrial accident. And it wasn't until about 50 years later that they found out, yes, we were keeping illegal arms for the British and the French, and that the Germans did blow it up intentionally. Okay. Now, some of you might have heard that, Harlem sometimes has a very negative reputation in New York City, which is greatly unfounded now. But at one time, it was not an easy place to live. In the 1930s, there was a terrible riot involving about 4,000 people. One was killed. Look at what the streets looked like. It was terrible, terrible rioting in New York City. Today, if you go to Harlem, totally different. It's one of the most beautiful parts of New York City. It's all regentrified. And we highly recommend, if you've never been there, to take a tour of Harlem. It's absolutely beautiful. Okay. Now, another scene of unrest was down in Greenwich Village at a place called the Stonewall Inn. It happened in 1969. The gays had been abused by the police for many, many years. Finally, they decided they've had it, and they decided to fight back against the police. And it really was considered the beginning of the gay revolution in the United States.
The gay community had been abused by the police. They were paying extortion money, and they finally decided to fight back. The place that has become pretty much a national landmark is this pub over here called the Stonewall Inn, and that's right in the West Village. And you can see the sign up here, the flags.
Yeah, President Obama declared it a national landmark at the time.
Well, let's move on to another scene here. Let's go to another catastrophe here. When we're telling people, a lot of people don't realize this, that during in 1945, a B-25 bomber, after the war was over, was driving through New York City, or flying through New York City on a very, very foggy day, and they hit the Empire State Building. They weren't used to tall buildings like this at the time.
And had no radar.
And that particular B-25 bomber crashed into the 79th floor of the Empire State Building. When the World Trade Center first happened, my first instinct, there was a mistake, but then you realize it wasn't. 79th Street, and 11 people died in this thing, but it survived. And there were two people, by the way. There was a woman in the elevator that actually went crashing down from the 72nd floor into the basement, and she survived.
Yeah. Now, hopefully this plays. It played a few minutes ago. Okay, we have two separate excerpts of an on-the-scene report about what went on. The first one is done by a British television group, and then the second one is done by an American group. Listen to the discrepancy between the two. Okay, we're gonna, and hopefully they play. They played a couple of minutes ago. Let's see if they work. Please.
The world's biggest skyscraper, New York's 1,248-foot-high Empire State Building, and a Mitchell bomber flying blind in a fog haze, chief actors in one of the strangest tragedies of the air. With visibility down almost to zero, traveling at 200 miles an hour, the bomber crashed with terrific impact into the 78th and 79th floors of the building, smashing through 7 walls. "13 people at work in offices were killed instantly, 26 were injured. A lift crashed down 80 floors, killing the occupants, and one man's body was found on a ledge 7 stories down. 2 days later, the 102-story building reopened, but the hole ripped in the Empire State remains a warning of the perils of low flying among skyscrapers."
Now, here's what the hole in the building looked like. Okay, one of the engines of the plane, remember, these are prop planes in those days, they weren't jets, dislodged from the fuselage and went entirely through the building. Okay, nobody, amazingly enough, on the ground was killed when the engine came out the other side, which was amazing. However, the propellers were turning and it cut a cable holding an elevator car. Okay, now you heard that the occupants died, right? Okay, now.
Now, but before you go on, Pat,
Okay, here's another picture.
about the 9/11 site, I didn't mean it was a problem. There were a number of plane crashes in buildings in New York City. I thought that was an accident at that time, that they didn't mean to crash into the building.
Yeah,
That's
until
what I
the
meant
second
by it.
plane hit.
Nothing to do with a political thing about 9/11 and doing like that. Just strictly, it was a plane accident, which they've had many of them in New York City, unfortunately.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that later on.
Yeah, but here you can see the damage and it actually literally went out the other side. Now, here is the American version of the same thing.
The Empire State Building, like all New York, was hidden by fog as a Mitchell bomber trying to reach Newark Airport crashed into the tallest structure in the world. When the plane hit the north side of the building, parts of it jammed in the structure and some plummeted down the elevator shaft. Disaster units organized in wartime were quick to respond to aid the wounded.
Okay, so you see controversial things like that. It's 40 Wall Street, by the way. This building was also hit.
What?
This is a Trump building. This building was also hit by a plane. You don't
People
hear a
don't
lot
know
of these
that.
things. This is a lot of things happen here, and here's more examples of
Yeah,
the
this one
planes.
did in 1952.
And these were accidents. They weren't anything.
Yeah, so that's why, again, when we heard about the first plane that went in, we thought, oh my God, another accident, a plane hit a building.
There was a New York Yankee, by the way, that got killed in a plane
Yeah,
on the street in the 80s in Manhattan.
yeah, same thing, yeah. But here, 5 people perished and also a lot of damage, but the building did not fall down.
Now, here is a man that caused some controversy in New York City. He is the sex symbol of New York City. His Rudolfo. Look at Rudolfo's name. Rudolfo Alfonso Raffaello Pierre Filibert Guglielmi de Valentina de Antequello. Can you imagine having to tell everyone that's your name? But that's what it was. Well, Rudolph Valentino wound up, unfortunately, dying of a burst appendix. And here he is to show you how it caused controversy in New York City. So many people came to pay honor to him, but it got a little out of hand as well. Here's what the picture looked like when he's being
Yeah, look at this mass funeral. Imagine that. There were women who were hysterical, fainting all over the place. It was really chaos all over the streets of New York when he died. Things got actually so bad that when women went by his coffin, they would start pulling hairs out of his head as souvenirs. So Mussolini, who was in charge of Italy at the time, actually sent over some of his guards to guard the building, to guard the body, to make sure they wouldn't take all the hair out of his head. Can you imagine that? That's how bad it was. Now, there is a place in New York City called Hart Island. It is a public potter's field, okay, in New York City, and it has been that for many years. It's gone through a metamorphosis of a lot of different things, but for many, many years, it was a potter's field. You can see.
Now, these are for people, nameless people, some homeless people, sometimes with no identities, and then they're buried here in a public burial. You can see what it is right now.
And they use prisoners from Rikers Island to bury the dead. Now, to show you, for a long time, it was limited to between 1,000 and 2,000 people a year buried here. As the time went on, they got much more conscious. If they knew the name of the person but couldn't find any relatives, they would keep a listing to make sure if somebody's relative did show up that they could reclaim the body. But during the first several months of the pandemic in New York, people were dying at such a high rate, they had nowhere to put the bodies. People hadn't made any kind of funeral arrangements. You know, this hit so quickly that they actually started having mass burials on Hart Island. But in this case, they carefully listed who the people were, where they died, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And many of them have been subsequently disinterred and given proper burials in cemeteries across New York City.
If you're wondering where this neighborhood is, it's opposite City Island. City Island is the east side of New York City. It's an island, a small island, only a couple of miles long, very nice community. And this island, Hart Island, is only probably maybe 300 acres from the mainland of the Bronx. So it's it. But let's move on to Chinatown and some of the controversy that's been in Chinatown. Here's old Chinatown. We have the largest population of Chinese in the United States. We have over 750,000 Chinese living in the 5 boroughs of New York City. And there was controversy. There was always gang wars. Remember, there were no women in Chinatown for a while. To give you an idea, in 1900, there were 3,000 men living in Chinatown, Chinese men, and there were 36 women. That's because there was a law called the 1882 Exclusion Act, which excluded Chinese in the late 1800s coming to America. That law eventually was repealed, but we can go into a whole thing. We do a whole thing on Chinatown. And here's one of the guys who was the leader of the Chinese gangs. His name over here to your left-hand side, his name is Mok Duck. And he was part of a Chinese, let's call it gang, called the Hip Sing Tongs. Those are associations and gangs.
Yeah.
And you can see a picture of what it looked like. There's no women there. Even today, when I see it, I'm kind of fascinated to see that there are a lot of women in Chinatown now today.
Right. Now, one of the things they had there were, if you see pictures of opium dens, a lot of the opium dens down there were staged to bring tourism down to Chinatown. They wanted the rich people from Fifth Avenue and such to come down to Chinatown. So they would stage these things in opium dens very often. They would, pay actresses to pretend that they were under the influence and, feign all kinds of things. And people would come down and they would pay to see these women down in these opium dens. There were real ones, but a lot of it was really just hype to get people to come to Chinatown.
New York has a reputation of being quite a dangerous place, and we've had people come in here with canes, and they actually have swords in there because they thought New York was it. One time, New York City was Satan's circus, There was an area there, and Sodom and Gomorrah, that's what it was. A lot of the police were corrupt. Here's a policeman, his name was Alexander Clubber Williams, who would club people with his things, and he made money by extorting money from different people, but he also bribed his way into a position. And here he is, Clubber Williams, and with a murder suspect, and they would collect a lot of money. And here are some things that some of these police officers would collect for people for extorting money from them as well. So they did that.
Yeah.
Now the city was quite crowded, Little Italy, as you probably know, because of the Italians in a lot of the Godfather movies. There's a classic picture of Little Italy at the time. A lot of these men were very corrupt. But one of the corruption, if you saw the movie The Godfather 2, there was a man in a white suit, and he was part of something called the Black Hand. This was the predecessor of Before the Mafia. And here is a letter over here. This is a real letter that we took from one of the museums in New York City about mafia. Look at this. This man wants $200 in an alley, or else he's going to wind up damaging that person and ruining his restaurant. And this is some of the things. And he would sign it with a black hand. And there was all kinds of corruption and all kinds of things going there. They would tell that they would burn your daughter unless you paid the money to the corruption. And these are older people who had restaurants and buildings there, and they would be threatened by this black hand. Eventually, if you saw the Godfather movie, Robert De Niro kills one of them. Eventually, this became the mafia. Now, there was a hero here. We've talked a lot of bad. Here's good. This man's name was Joseph or Giuseppe Petrosino, and he was a lieutenant in the police force, and he wound up protecting his community and his people that he grew up with, who came from Italy to America. And he was eventually, by the way, he went back to infiltrate to see more about the Black Hand and the mafia, and he winds up coming out of his building. He's supposed to be very quiet, and he winds up walking out of his hotel, and he winds up getting killed. And by the way, they named a park in his honor there. It's called Petrosino Park. And if you look at the picture, which is hard to see, the man here with the hat on, that is his grandson. And Petrosino's grandson is a police officer in New York City.
Yeah.
And here is the park
Yeah.
called Petrosino
Yeah,
Square.
it's in Nolita. that part of
Nolita,
New York
north of
City.
Little Italy.
Right. Now, we just said that was kind of the preeminence of the mafia or the mob, but you've always had gangs in New York from the very beginning of time in New York City. A lot of them came to fruition though during really the late 1800s. One of the first big gang leaders was a guy named Dopey Benny Fine. He's called Dopey Benny Fine. Supposedly had an adenoids condition, so he spoke strangely. Anyway, but Dopey Benny Fine and his gang were hired by shop owners to put down union organizers. Very often they were women who were trying to organize, especially the garment industry. And Dopey Benny Fine got a nickname. He was called a criminal with ethics because no matter what they offered him, he refused to beat women up. And he was Jewish. He refused to beat especially Jewish people who were trying to organize. So they called him a criminal with ethics.
He said, "These are my neighbors I grew up with. I'm not doing
really-
anything against them."
Right. Okay. Now, of course, one of the most famous group of mafia were led by a man named Lucky Luciano.
And look at this, one of his henchmen at that time was a lieutenant of his thing, and that was Al Capone.
Now, Al Capone was not from Chicago. A lot of people think he was, but Al Capone actually was one of the enforcers on the docks in Brooklyn, especially in the Red Hook area. And he was going against the Irish mob that was there. And in a fight on one of the docks, he actually got slashed across the face, hence his nickname Scarface. And to get away, Luciano actually had him shipped off to Chicago to protect him. And of course, the rest is history.
Now, an interesting relationship was between two men who grew up here. They were young men growing up in the Lower East Side. They were teenagers at the time. And here's this man, Lucky Luciano, over here, who was a tough guy, but he was a big guy. He's probably 6'2", I'd say. And here's this little Jewish kid over here, this Meyer Lansky, who was also a little bit of a gangster at the time. And they met in the street one day, and Lucky Luciano decided to beat this little Jewish kid up over here, Meyer Lansky. And every time he knocked this kid on the ground, he gets up and he starts fighting again. Lucky Luciano says, I like that kid. He's got gumption. Later on, they decided to collaborate on a gang called Murder Incorporated. This was Italians and this was Jewish. And Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano became partners in crime. One of the guys who was not a good guy was a man named Arthur Fleigenheimer. You probably know him. You probably don't know the name, but you might know him as Dutch Schultz.
Right.
With a name like Arthur Fleigenheimer, he's not going to get a lot of respect.
And
he was a real criminal, this guy.
Yeah, he made a fatal mistake. He decided he wanted to kill a man named Thomas Dewey. Some of you might have remembered the great headline, Dewey defeats Truman, which wasn't true. But before that, Dewey was the prosecutor in New York City who was going after all of these gangs. And Dutch Schultz said he wanted to kill him. And all the other gang leaders said, don't do that. You're going to put too much heat on us if you attempt to kill him. Just leave him alone. Well, he refused to do that. He tried to go after Dewey, but they got to him first, and he was gunned down by the mafia themselves. Okay. And that started kind of a tradition. Paul Castellano, also gang wars, was killed outside Sparks Steakhouse.
And look who set this up. Go back to that picture for a second. This is John Gotti, by the way.
Yeah,
he wasn't a leader in his gang at all at that time. And look, this is John Gotti would become a mob boss.
Right.
And he was known as the Teflon Bomb.
Don, right?
Don, if you know him.
Yeah. And then you had Albert Annunziata, who was gunned down while he was getting his hair cut.
Anastasia, 1957. And here's a guy, Arnold Rothstein. Now, this is a Jewish guy who was like a brilliant guy. He was a brilliant guy, but he decided to really be a criminal in case. And he eventually also was killed by some of his people.
Right.
But not another controversial thing.
But he was involved. His most famous thing was the White Sox scandal of, the baseball players and bribes that were taken in baseball. And he was involved with that. And eventually he also met his fate at the Park Central Hotel in New York City. Now here's another man more recently.
This is Crazy Joe Gallo. Okay, now that's near and dear to our hearts because he, in Little Italy, if you go to Mulberry Street, there is a building there with the holes of when he was killed. He was killed in Umberto's Clam House in the city. One of the things interesting about him is he had a way of extorting money from people.
Yeah. And what he would do is he had a house on President Street in Brooklyn, and he had a lion in his basement. And he would threaten people by saying, if you don't pay up, I'm going to have you visit my lion. Needless to say, most people paid up. Well, somewhere down the road, he was put in prison, never on a murder charge, though. Put in prison. And while he's in prison, Hollywood comes out with a movie called The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. And it starred Jerry Orbach was the main star in the middle. Robert De Niro's one of his earliest roles. And Orbach played a character called Kid Sally. Well, Kid Sally in the movie had a lion in his basement. And and you can see here he is with the lion.
Now, Crazy Joe Gallo was ready to get released out of prison, and he hears about this movie that was shot called The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. And there were too many similarities between him and the lion in the basement and all these different things. And he says, when I get out of prison, I want to meet this guy, Jerry Orbach, who's playing me in the movie. I'm gonna find out what he's doing with this thing. They wind up contacting Jerry Orbach, Jerry Orbach starts writing his last will. And what happens is they become best friends. And the night that Gallo is killed in Umberto's clam house, that was the night that Jerry Orbach was doing a roast in his honor, and they were killed in the same thing. And here's a little bit of a clip. Hopefully it'll play. Okay, clip from the movie. And you'll see how they're playing up. Let's see what happens here.
Anthony Pastrumo, one of the big five mafia bosses in greater New York, is a strong family man.
How we know that?
Go, Starka.
Anthony Pastrumo, also known as Bacala.
Mother of God, pray for us sinners now.
He became the big boss after his best friend went for a swim with a jukebox tied around his neck.
Hey, 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 hey.
Kid Sally Palumbo.
Anybody looks to rob me, I put him under the water.
He's out to take over the mob, but that will take some thinking and...
I got important things to think about.
Well...
You said.
I think I'm gonna stand.
Shut up your face.
Hey, you. Hey, you.
No.
Jimmy Breslin's the gang that couldn't shoot straight. A ridiculous look at disorganized crime.
All right, what did you see?
See what? What I can see like this, huh? You think I got eyeballs in my head?
What can I tell you?
What could I tell you?
What could I tell you?
Brooklyn D.A. Goodman expressed concern over the possibility of another gang war.
I am concerned over the possibility of another gang war.
It's a beautiful day for the raid here on the South Brooklyn docks.
Didn't your mother teach you to knock?
This morning, the entire Palumbo mob pleaded guilty to conspiracy to murder Brooklyn.
MGM.
A little comedy on the mafia. Here is Umberto's clam house. They've moved it a little bit. By the way, if you go up here on the right-hand side, where that men are congregating, there are holes in the walls here today. They left that there as a symbolic thing.
Never moved.
But there's been lots of mafias here. Here's the Hell's Kitchen Mafia. This is called Westies. These guys, remember, they were Italian mafias, black mafias, Jewish mafias, Irish mafias.
These were Irish.
Everyone. And a lot of mafias, and they didn't always get together.
Then some of the most notorious of them all is the Russian mob that exists. Most of them are in Brooklyn, in an area called Brighton Beach, out in Brooklyn. Now, the problem with them is they don't know the difference between anything. They don't know they're breaking a law. They just do whatever they want. So they can be really notorious here. Then you have, more of your modern gangs, like your Crips and your Bloods and your Latin Kings and all of that. And, you hear especially with the immigration crisis about some of the gangs in New York City. Now, New York has also hosted some unsavory individuals. Here's a man named Salvador Dali, who was, needless to say, an eccentric artist. One of the things he was hired to do was to design a window for Bonwood Teller department store. Bonwood Teller department store used to be where Trump Tower is now, just to get an idea, on Fifth Avenue. He came out with this bizarre window, and it was covered up so the public couldn't see it yet. The management of Bonwood Teller goes in, they look at this window, they said, this doesn't represent us. We can't do this. You can't have this window. Well, Dolly got so upset that he took the bathtub that was part of the set, he threw it through the plate glass window, was eventually arrested, put in jail, and when he goes before the judge the next morning, he had his whole face covered in green eyeshadow to show you what a bizarre
Strange
person
character.
he was.
Now, in the east side of Manhattan, there is a Tompkins Square Park there, and here is a man, homeless man, who actually killed people and made soup of their body and fed it to the homeless people. His name is Daniel Rakowitz. He's still in prison today.
Yeah,
Now we all know about David Berkowitz,
the son of
who,
Sam.
by the way, was doing seances in a place in Yonkers. This is Untermeyer Park, and you know, kind of one of crazy guys.
Yeah.
Blackouts of 1965, 1977.
Yeah, you probably experienced some of those too, because most of them hit the whole Northeast. So that was bad. Okay, no explanation needed. We're not going to go into any kind of detail about 9/11. We had a terrible hurricane, Sandy, in 2012, which totally destroyed. Look at how high the water is here. I mean, it flooded everything. New York also has been home to many haunted places in New York City.
One of the haunted restaurants in New York City with notice there's no marquee in there and no thing. This is One If My Land, Two If My Sea. This is Aaron Burr's Carriage House, and the restaurant is haunted by Theodosia Burr. That's Aaron Burr's daughter. And the waiters will swear to you that the tablecloths move and the chairs move and the silverware moves and everything else. It's a beautiful restaurant, 5-star restaurant, and it's in the West Village.
Right.
It's called One If My Land, Two If My Sea.
Yeah.
There's another haunted place.
Yeah, it's called the Merchant's House. This is Gertrude Treadwell. And Gertrude Treadwell basically was kind of held prisoner in the house by her father and not allowed to marry the man she loved. And supposedly she haunts the museum today. And we can tell you from personal accounts, we think she does because we've had an encounter with her. Anyway, there's another woman named Olive Thomas who died mysteriously in Paris. And she took poison supposedly by mistake. Other people said no, she was murdered by her husband. And she probably haunts the Ambassador Theater. They see ghostly sightings of a beautiful young woman there. Another sighting is at the Belasco Theater. David Belasco was the owner of the theater and a manager. And even somebody named Laura Linney, the actress, has definitely seen David Belasco's ghost. Now, to end on a kind of a lighter note, New York City is a frequent target to get attacked on film and cause havoc. Godzilla has come to New York and tried to take down the Brooklyn Bridge, among other places. If you saw the movie Day After Tomorrow with the ice storm, they're trapped in the New York Public Library as the city of Manhattan freezes. Armageddon, you see the meteors taking out the Empire State Building coming through Grand Central Terminal. If you saw the original Planet of the Apes, they never left Earth. They actually were in New York when he finds the remnants of the Statue of Liberty. Independence Day, they hung over New York as well as many other cities. Deep Impact, here we go again. We're being hit another time. I Am Legend with Will Smith. This is what was left of humanity after a plague. And he lived all over New York. It's a good place to see. And of course, Long Live the King. And here he is. The King, he's been portrayed in many movies. 1933 was the original with Fay Wray. Then in 1976 with Jessica Lange. Now this time he wasn't on top of the Empire State Building. This time they put him on top of the Twin Towers. When they made another remake of King Kong in 2005, again, he was put on top of the Empire State Building. Now, more recently, King Kong and Godzilla, who were at war with one another, actually got together to get rid of the other monsters who were terrorizing New York. So, all in all, we will survive and keep going.
Let's open it up to questions and answers, everybody. You're welcome to ask any questions, add some comments. We've had some really good comments here.
Yeah.
Because people had some good things. Okay, we always learn from you guys.
Okay, if any of you want to make a comment, you should be able to unmute yourselves.
Let's get some of the answers there we go.
Okay, we'll try to answer some
Can
of
you
the
guys
questions.
hear us? Can you guys hear us?
Yeah, we'll try to answer some of the questions. One was, how did Hetty Green make her money? She actually inherited a lot of it. She also had a father who believed that girls should be educated and taught her finance. She was married a few times, and every time she married a wealthier man and inherited money and kept multiplying it, multiplying it, and multiplying it.
Okay.
Right. That's a good, I have to look up the book. They wrote a book about her. It's good. Okay. Best in Company. Oh, so, and she remembers. That's good. What else? Somebody had a question. About our ghost encounter. Okay. We went into, we were filming outside of the merchant's house and everything was fine. We had, this was a videotape in those days. We go into the merchant's house and we're filming, and every time they talked about Gertrude Treadwell, we didn't know. We kept filming. We get out and we are previewing what we filmed. Every time Gertrude Treadwell's name was mentioned, there was a blank on the videotape. We have no idea why. Maybe she didn't want us to know what was going on in her house.
Okay.
But then it went back on again, and we talked about something else. It was fine. Mentioned her again. There was a blank on the videotape. So, so we believe something went on. Let me see what else.
Okay, Barbara, let's see.
Anybody else? You cannot unmute yourselves. I don't know why.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can do.
Is Gianna, are you there?
Let me see if I can.
She's
do it.
control.
Hi. Yes, so because it's in a webinar format, folks aren't able to unmute or show themselves via video. So that's why we're having folks throw any questions that they have into the chat or Q&A section. That way we can at least address them that way.
Yeah, Hetty Green left money to her 2 kids, but I don't know if that makes up for the leg.
How did Hell's Kitchen get their name?
That's a good question.
Okay, good question. Well, Hell's Kitchen is, by the way, Times Square area, and it's west of Times Square. If you look at that thing, the police would go down there. It was really tough. They had the Westies. That was one of the gangs that were there. It was such a tough neighborhood that one policeman was overheard talking to another one, and he said to his fellow policemen, because they go there, never move one on one, always two at a time. And one policeman says to the other one, he says, you know, this neighborhood is hell. And the other policeman says, you know, this is worse than hell. This is Hell's Kitchen, where everything brews.
And that's where they come up.
And that's where it came
Okay,
from.
somebody asked again if the presentation was recorded. Yes. And the library's sending it out, what did you say, next week sometime?
Hopefully tomorrow, the earliest. If you don't get it tomorrow, don't worry. Sometime early next week, you'll get it.
I'm not sure what happened with the sound, but notice the sound worked.
It's
in some
funny, like
cases,
a
and it
couple
didn't
of
work
them,
in
it didn't
others.
work, but
Yeah, we're
most of them
surprised.
did.
Most of the time it does.
So sorry about that.
May West was a trip.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let me see what.
Anybody else have any questions? that we
Ghost
can answer?
encounters. Oh, keep going. Let's see what you have. Thank you. You're welcome, by the way.
Oh, that's interesting that Capone claimed it was done by shrapnel. You know, it wasn't. It was done on the docks.
Yeah,
of Red
he
Hook.
was a stevedore, you know, one of those guys that was in Red Hook, Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Well, we read, and by the way, information is very varied. You know, we train tour guides to be tour guides in New York City, and you would be amazed with the amount of information that is mistaken and wrong. We take pride in trying to be as accurate as we possibly can. But sometimes you'll read things. There's a story about Central Park. There was a dog there called Balto. And in the book, in a book about Central Park, it says Balto died, but based on the statue, died of the rigors of the race. That was the, eventually became the Iditarod. Balto never died. He lived 7 years longer than that.
After the race, so
But
he
this
didn't
is
die
in a
of
this is in a
children.
book supposedly by the
Yeah.
Central Park historian.
So sometimes you'll get, different versions and you have to pick one that you think is correct. Other times you'll only get one person that
We think we're right more often than not.
We try.
But
We
sometimes,
try.
you you've read things and you don't
Yeah.
get this.
Yeah.
Let's see, we owned a pharmacy in Red Hook.
Ah,
in,
I could tell you
Gallo Gang
stories.
territory.
Oh, okay. So you
Okay.
understand.
Yeah, Red Hook is quite an interesting
Yeah.
neighborhood. We do 7 different tours of Brooklyn and like that.
Yeah. Red
Okay.
Hook's really changing.
So
Yeah. Anything else? Anybody be happy to answer?
we have many people, by the way, in Massachusetts and Connecticut that are our guests. We have over 185 clients doing Zooms with us right now. And we have a lot of fun. This is our fun job.
Yeah. And if any of you,
Hope you guys enjoyed it.
Mhm.
Okay.
If any of you come down to New York and you want a tour, let us know. We do, a lot of things we do is we do van tours. We have our own van and we take families out and,
10 to
small
12 people,
groups.
10 to 12 people. And then we
It's a
also have
lot of
buses,
fun.
of course, larger buses.
Yeah, but if you want to do, we do a lot of things, so you can see some of these things in person. They're finding lots of
And
bodies.
you
in the
guys know,
Kiwanis Canal.
you guys know that Susan's the smart one in the family and I'm the shy one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds like a lot of you are New Yorkers
We
originally.
also do dog tours in New York City. We have 2 golden retrievers. They're upstairs barking. If you guys are dog people, the Westminster Dog Show hires us every year to take out these pampered pooches. We have fun with them. They're a lot of fun. We once had 21 dogs and the largest dog was 11 pounds.
Mhm.
They
Oh my
were,
gosh.
they were
Yeah.
cute.
Is it okay? Somebody asked if we could post our contact information. that
Sure, if you'd like to, yeah, feel free to pop it into the chat.
Yeah, the best way to contact us is really by email. So let me put our email.
And our phone number is 914-842 842. When am I forgetting this? Oh, you have a new phone number. 843-2982. 914-843-2982. New phone number.
Yeah.
843-2982. 914 area code.
Yeah, but the best way really is to email us and we can give you information and then you can give us a call.
And thank you for having us. We appreciate that. And we enjoy doing these things. We have over 80 different Zoom presentations. And you guys, if you like this, you'd like some of the other ones.
Let me see. I think the email just went to me. Let me just pop that into the chat for everyone. Let's see.
What said host and panel?
There we go.
We always learn a lot from you guys. Cheers.
Awesome. All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much to Susan and Art for presenting for us. Great presentation. I definitely learned way more. I always thought I had at least a little bit of it, but it was so nice to be able to go deeper into some of these topics. So thank you. We appreciate your time. And we hope to have you back.
Okay, thank you.
Take
Thank you
care.
for having us.
You
Bye.
too. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Night.